When a destitute elderly woman saves an abandoned baby during a deadly blizzard, she has no idea he'll return 20 years later as a millionaire, just as her heart begins to fail. Before we continue, consider my humble request to like and subscribe. It's completely free. The wind howled like a hungry animal outside Martha Wilson's small apartment. At 70, her bones felt the cold more deeply than ever before. She kept the heat turned down to save money, wrapping herself in layers of sweaters instead. Her Social Security check only stretched so far. Martha winced as she stood from her worn armchair. Her arthritis was acting up again. With careful steps, she made her way to the kitchen to boil water for tea, her nightly ritual before bed. The ancient kettle was one of the few items she had kept from her former life before everything fell apart. As she waited for the water to heat, Martha gazed out her window at the swirling snow. The blizzard had settled over the city earlier that day, coating everything in white. Beautiful, but dangerous for someone her age. She wouldn't be able to venture out tomorrow if it kept up. The kettle began to whistle when Martha heard a strange sound cutting through the howl of the wind. She turned off the burner and listened more carefully. There it was again. A cry that sounded almost like a cat, but not quite. Probably just the wind playing tricks, she murmured to herself, but something pulled her toward the front door. Martha wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and shuffled to the entrance of her ground-floor apartment. The crying grew louder. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the door and pulled it open, just a crack. The bitter cold rushed in, along with a sound that made her heart stop. Not a cat, a baby. Martha pulled the door open wider and looked down. There, nestled in a thin blanket on her welcome mat, lay a tiny infant with skin tinged blue from the cold. "Oh, my Lord!" Martha gasped, immediately bending to scoop up the bundle. The pain in her joints disappeared as adrenaline took over. She brought the baby inside, kicking the door shut behind her. The infant couldn't have been more than a few days old. Martha cradled the cold little body against her chest, rubbing gently to warm it. "Who would leave you out in weather like this?" she whispered, her heart breaking and mending all at once. She carried the baby to her small bathroom, turning up the heat as she passed the thermostat. Money worries faded in the face of this emergency. Martha ran warm water in the sink and carefully, so carefully, unwrapped the thin blanket. A boy, she discovered, with a shock of dark hair and eyes squeezed shut against the cold. As she bathed him in the warm water, memories washed over her. Painful images she had locked away decades ago. Another baby, another impossible choice. Her hands trembled as she lifted the now warmer infant from the water and wrapped him in her softest towel. "You're safe now," she promised, her voice cracking. "I won't let anyone take you from me." The baby's eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused. His tiny hand found her finger and gripped it with surprising strength. In that moment, something long dormant awakened in Martha's heart. She searched the blanket for a note, some explanation, but found nothing, just the child, abandoned in the snow. Martha knew she should call the police, but hesitated. The system was cold and impersonal. She had seen what happened to children nobody wanted. "Just tonight," she told herself. "I'll keep you warm tonight and figure things out in the morning." Martha heated a pot of water and found an old glass bottle she could sterilize. She mixed sugar and the last of her milk to feed the hungry infant. As he suckled greedily at the makeshift bottle, Martha studied his face. "James," she whispered. It was her father's name, a good, strong name for a boy who had already survived so much. That night, Martha slept in her armchair with baby James nestled against her chest. For the first time in years, she felt needed, necessary. The weight of the child anchored her to the present in a way nothing else had. Morning came with difficult decisions. Martha knew what she should do: call the authorities, hand the baby over. But as James stirred against her, his dark eyes finding hers with such trust, She couldn't bear the thought. I raised one child, she told herself. I can raise another. Martha had been alone since her husband died 15 years earlier. Their only daughter had moved across the country, calling only on holidays. This little boy had no one but her. The snow continued to fall outside, sealing them in their small world. Martha made a list of what she would need: diapers, formula, clothes. Her social security check had arrived yesterday, and though it meant she would have to be even more careful with heat and food for herself, she could make it work. "We'll manage, James," she told the baby as she fed him again. "One day at a time." That afternoon, when the snow lightened, Martha bundled James against her chest, beneath her coat, and ventured to the corner store. Mrs. Patel, who had owned the place for 30 years, raised her eyebrows at the sight of the infant. "Martha Wilson, where did you get a baby at your age?" Martha had prepared for this. "My grandson. My daughter had an emergency and needed someone to watch him for a while." The lie tasted bitter, but necessary. Mrs. Patel's face softened. "First time I've heard about a grandchild. We haven't been close, my daughter and I, but things change." That, at least, wasn't a lie. As Martha gathered supplies, she felt Mrs. Patel watching her. The woman insisted on giving her a discount and added a hand-knitted baby blanket she kept behind the counter. "My daughter makes them. This one hasn't sold, and it's warmer than what you have him wrapped in." Martha's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Indira." "You need help, you ask," Mrs. Patel said firmly. "No shame in that." Back in her apartment, Martha created a makeshift crib from a drawer lined with blankets. As she placed James in it, his little hand caught her finger again. She remembered her whispered promise from the night before, and felt its weight. "I'm too old for this," she told him, honestly. "But I'm all you've got right now, and you're all I've got too." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and creating a clean white slate. Martha knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, she had a reason to face tomorrow. The next 7 years passed in a blur of small joys and growing fears. Martha never reported finding James. Each month that passed made it harder to explain why she hadn't come forward immediately. Instead, she crafted a careful story about a grandson whose mother had abandoned him. Few questioned it. Those who did received vague answers about family troubles, too painful to discuss. Martha's small apartment transformed with James's presence. Colorful drawings covered the refrigerator. Toy cars lined the windowsill. His laughter filled spaces that had been silent for too long. To make ends meet, Martha took in mending and alterations. Her fingers, though stiff with arthritis, could still guide a needle deftly enough. On good days, she baked extra loaves of bread to sell to neighbors. Every penny went toward giving James what he needed. "Grandma, look!" 7-year-old James burst through the door one afternoon, waving a paper. His dark eyes, so serious even as a baby, shone with pride. "I got a gold star on my math test." Martha set aside her sewing and opened her arms. James ran into them, a whirlwind of energy that both exhausted and invigorated her. "Let me see that, my smart boy." She studied the test, noting the careful handwriting and confident answers. James had always been quick with numbers. "This deserves a celebration. How about cinnamon toast?" It was a simple treat, butter, sugar, and cinnamon on day-old bread. But to them, it was a feast. As they ate, Martha noticed James watching her carefully. "What's on your mind?" she asked, wiping a smudge of cinnamon from his cheek. James hesitated. "Tommy at school said you're too old to be my grandma. He said his grandma is way younger than you." A knot formed in Martha's stomach. At 77, she knew how she appeared to others, a frail woman with a young child. The questions had been increasing lately. "Well," she said carefully, "some grandmas are younger and some are older. That's all there is to it." James nodded, seemingly satisfied. But Martha knew the questions would only multiply as he grew older and more aware. That night, after tucking James into bed in their shared bedroom, Martha sat at the kitchen table, counting out pills. Her heart medication had doubled in price last month. The doctor had added blood pressure pills too. Even with Medicare, the costs ate into their tight budget. A knock at the door startled her. Visitors were rare, especially in the evening. Martha shuffled to answer it, her slippers whispering against the worn linoleum. A young woman in a crisp suit stood in the hallway. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Diane Turner from Child Protective Services. We've received a report about your grandson. May I come in?" The ground seemed to tilt beneath Martha's feet. This was the moment she had feared for 7 years. "It's rather late," she managed to say. "I understand, but this is important." The woman's voice was kind but firm. Martha let her in, heart hammering painfully against her ribs. She offered tea, playing for time, trying to calm her shaking hands. "Mrs. Wilson, we've received concerning reports about James's living situation." Diane glanced around the small apartment, taking notes. "I understand you're his grandmother, but we have no record of legal guardianship. Can you explain that?" Martha clutched her teacup tighter. "My daughter, she left him with me as a baby, never came back." "And you didn't report this abandonment?" "She wasn't," Martha faltered. "I knew she couldn't handle motherhood. It was better this way." Diane's eyes softened slightly. "Mrs. Wilson, I can see you care for James, but there are serious concerns. Your age, your health, the financial strain. We need to ensure James is in a stable environment." "This is his home," Martha said, her voice trembling. "I'm all he has." "I need to see James and his sleeping arrangements. Then we'll need to schedule a formal assessment." Martha led her to the bedroom where James slept peacefully, his math test proudly displayed on the wall above his bed. Diane took more notes, asked more questions. By the time she left, promising to return in 3 days, Martha felt hollowed out. She sat by James's bed that night, watching him sleep. Her body ached with a bone-deep weariness that no rest could cure. She had always known this day might come, but had pushed the thought away, living in the fragile bubble they had created together. The next morning, she told James they would be having a visitor. "A nice lady who wants to make sure you're happy here," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. James frowned. "I am happy. Aren't you?" Martha pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his hair. "Happier than I've been in decades, my love." For the next 2 days, Martha cleaned every corner of their small apartment. She baked cookies and made sure James's clothes were neatly mended. She coached him on what to say. Yes, he ate 3 meals a day. Yes, he went to school regularly. No, he was never left alone. But when Diane returned, she brought a colleague. Their questions were more pointed. They spoke to James alone, while Martha waited in the kitchen, twisting a dish towel between her fingers. That evening, after they left, Martha received a phone call. James was sitting at the table, doing homework. She turned away from him, keeping her voice low. "I understand your concerns," she said into the receiver, "but please, he needs stability." James looked up. "Who are you talking to, Grandma?" Martha forced a smile. "Just grown-up business. Finish your math problems." That night, Martha couldn't sleep. She wrote a letter instead, pouring out everything she couldn't say aloud. How she had found James, why she had kept him, how he had saved her, as much as she had saved him. She sealed it in an envelope with his name. The next day brought another knock. This time, Diane wasn't alone. A police officer stood beside her. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm sorry, but we're here to take James into temporary protective custody. The court has ordered an emergency placement while your case is reviewed." Martha felt the world collapsing around her. James, sensing something terrible, clung to her skirt. "Grandma, what's happening?" Martha knelt before him, ignoring the pain in her knees. "James, listen to me. These people think you need to stay somewhere else for a little while." "I don't want to go." His voice rose in panic. "I want to stay with you!" Martha cupped his face in her weathered hands. "I know, my brave boy, and I'm going to do everything I can to bring you home. But right now, you need to be strong." As they led James away, his cries echoed down the hallway. Martha stood in the doorway, every instinct screaming to run after him, to fight anyone who tried to separate them. But she knew that would only make things worse. When the door closed behind them, the silence was deafening. Martha moved to the window, watching as they helped James into a car. Just before ducking inside, he looked up at her window. Martha pressed her palm against the glass. "I'll find a way," she whispered to the empty room. "I promise." 20 years later, James Chen adjusted his tie in the elevator mirror as he ascended to the top floor of the glass and steel tower that housed Chen Technologies. At 27, he was used to being the youngest person in boardrooms, but today's meeting with potential investors made even his confident demeanor waver. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. "They're all here, conference room A." James took a deep breath. The surveillance software his company had developed was revolutionizing security systems worldwide. Today's meeting could take them from successful startup to global corporation. As the elevator doors opened, James pushed away thoughts of the upcoming presentation and focused instead on the question that had consumed him for months: the search for Martha Wilson. After being taken from Martha's apartment that day 20 years ago, James had bounced between 3 foster homes before being adopted at age 10 by the Chens, a kind couple who recognized his gift for mathematics and technology. They had given him love, stability, and opportunities Martha could never have provided. But he had never forgotten her. The envelope she had pressed into his hand as they took him away, the one explaining how she had found him abandoned in a blizzard, had become worn from rereading. For years he had wondered about the woman who had saved his life, who had raised him for 7 years despite her age and poverty. Finding her had proven nearly impossible. By the time he was old enough to search in earnest, Martha's old apartment building had been demolished. Records were spotty, leads went nowhere, and James began to fear she might have passed away, never knowing what became of him. "James!" His business partner May waved from the end of the hallway. "We are waiting." James nodded, pushing personal thoughts aside. "Coming." The meeting went brilliantly. Their demonstration of NeoGuard, the adaptive security system James had designed, impressed even the most skeptical investors. By afternoon, they had secured the funding needed to expand into European markets. "We should celebrate," May suggested as they packed up their presentation materials. "Dinner at Luca's?" James shook his head. "Rain check?" "I'm meeting with that private investigator again." May's excitement dimmed. "Any progress?" "Maybe. He found a Martha Wilson who moved to a small town called Millfield about 18 years ago. It's only a 3-hour drive from here." "That's great," May said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Just don't get your hopes up too high, okay? It's been 20 years. James nodded, though hope had already taken root. "I know." That evening, instead of joining the team celebration, James sat in his sleek apartment reviewing the investigator's report. Photos showed a modest bungalow in a working-class neighborhood. Property records confirmed it belonged to a Martha Wilson, age 97. 97. The number hit James hard. She had been 77 when they took him away. 20 years was a long time, especially at that age. James booked a hotel in Millfield for the weekend. He would drive there Friday after work. For 3 days, the thought of seeing Martha again both energized and terrified him. What if she didn't remember him? Worse, what if she didn't want to see him? Friday afternoon found James navigating his luxury car through the narrow streets of Millfield. The GPS directed him to a street lined with small, well-kept homes. Flowers bloomed in tiny front yards. Children played on sidewalks. It was a world away from his high-rise urban lifestyle. He parked outside the blue bungalow that matched the photos. A ramp had been added to the front steps. Curtains were drawn across the windows. James sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes, gathering courage. Finally, he approached the door and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. The door of the neighboring house opened and an older woman peered out. "Can I help you?" James turned, suddenly uncertain. "I'm looking for Martha Wilson. Does she still live here?" The woman studied him carefully before responding. "She does, but she's at the community center right now. Bingo day." Relief and disappointment warred in James's chest. "Could you tell me how to get there?" 10 minutes later, James stood in the doorway of the Millfield Community Center's main hall. About 30 seniors sat at tables, focused intently on their bingo cards. At the front of the room, a young woman called out numbers, and there she was. Martha sat near the back, her white hair thinner than he remembered, her shoulders more hunched, but her eyes, those kind eyes that had looked at him with such love, were unmistakable, even behind thicker glasses. James moved toward her table, heart pounding. An elderly man sitting beside Martha noticed him first and nudged her. She looked up, confusion crossing her face at the sight of the well-dressed stranger approaching. "Martha Wilson?" James's voice caught. She squinted up at him. "Yes. Do I know you, young man?" The bingo caller continued in the background. Someone yelled, "Bingo!" excitedly from across the room. But for James, the world had narrowed to this moment, this woman. "It's me," he said softly. "It's James." Martha's bingo card slipped from her fingers. She stared at him, disbelief warring with recognition. Her hand trembled as she reached up to touch his face. "James," she whispered. "My James?" He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Around them, people were staring, but neither noticed. Martha stood slowly, her aged body betraying the quickness of her emotions. "They took you away," she said, her voice breaking. "I tried to fight it, but they said I was too old, too poor." "I know," James said. "I got your letter. I kept it all these years." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "You grew up so handsome, so tall." James couldn't hold back any longer. He pulled Martha into a gentle embrace, mindful of her fragility. She felt so small in his arms, like a bird with hollow bones, but her grip was surprisingly strong as she clung to him. "I looked for you for so long," he told her. "I never stopped looking." They left the bingo game behind, walking slowly to a small cafe across from the community center. Martha's steps were careful, measured. James matched his pace to hers, offering his arm for support. Over coffee and pie, James told Martha about his life after being taken away, the foster homes, his adoption, his education, and finally, his success in creating Chen Technologies. "A millionaire," Martha said, shaking her head in wonder. "And here I was, just hoping you had enough to eat and a warm place to sleep." "Because of you," James said, reaching across to take her weathered hand. "You saved my life that night, and every day after, until they took me away." Martha's eyes clouded. "I wasn't ready to let you go. Selfish, maybe. They were right that you deserved more than what I could give you." "No," James said firmly. "What you gave me was everything. Love, safety, the knowledge that I mattered to someone. That's why I had to find you." Martha looked down at their joined hands, his strong and smooth, hers thin and mapped with blue veins. "And now you have. What happens next?" James smiled, the future suddenly crystal clear. "Now, I get to take care of you, the way you took care of me." The weekend in Millfield stretched into a week as James rearranged meetings and delegated responsibilities to spend time with Martha. Each day revealed new layers to the woman who had saved him. Martha's tiny home was meticulously organized, but showed signs of financial struggle. The roof leaked in one corner, the heating system was unreliable, yet photographs covered every surface. Children from the neighborhood, friends from the community center, and one faded school photo of a young boy with serious dark eyes. James recognized himself at 7 years old. "You kept this all these years?" he asked, touching the frame. Martha nodded. "Your teacher gave it to me the day before they took you. It was all I had left." On his third day in Millfield, James noticed Martha's medicine cabinet, filled with orange prescription bottles, many with only a few pills remaining. "Are you taking all of these?" he asked, concerned. Martha waved dismissively. "When I can afford the copays, the heart medication comes first. The rest—" She shrugged. "You make choices at my age." That afternoon, James drove Martha to her doctor's office, insisting on a complete checkup. While Martha was being examined, James spoke with the pharmacist at the clinic. "I'd like to pay for all of Mrs. Wilson's prescriptions for the next year," he said, handing over his credit card. "And please call me directly if she ever misses a refill." The pharmacist's eyes widened at the name on the platinum card. "Are you related to Mrs. Wilson?" James smiled. "She's my grandmother." Later, over dinner at Martha's favorite local restaurant, a modest diner where the waitress knew her by name, James made his proposal. "I want you to come live with me," he said. "I have a 4-bedroom condo in the city. The guest suite has its own bathroom with safety rails already installed." Martha set down her fork, studying him. "James, I'm nearly 100 years old. I don't transplant well." "Then let me buy you a better house here, or fix up this one, new roof, better heating, whatever you need." Martha reached across the table and patted his hand. "What I need isn't something money can fix, but I'm grateful for the offer." "At least let me help with the medical bills and home repairs," James insisted. "Please, Martha, you gave me everything when you had nothing. Let me give something back." Martha's eyes grew distant. "There are things you don't know about me, James. Things I never told you." "Like what?" Martha sighed, looking suddenly every one of her 97 years. "Not tonight, but soon. I promise." The next morning, James was on a video call with Mai when a crash from the bathroom interrupted them. "I'll call you back," he said urgently, ending the call. He found Martha on the bathroom floor, conscious but unable to get up. "I'm fine," she insisted, as James helped her to the couch. "Just dizzy for a moment." But James saw the way she clutched her chest, how her breathing came too fast. He called an ambulance despite her protests. At the hospital, a doctor with kind eyes and a grave expression took James aside. "Your grandmother has experienced a minor heart attack, and I'm concerned about some of her test results." "What do you mean?" James asked, fear gripping him. "Has she mentioned any chest pain, fatigue, shortness of breath?" James shook his head. "She's been hiding it, hasn't she?" The doctor nodded. "Her heart is failing. It's not uncommon at her age, but—" She hesitated. "Given her overall condition, we're looking at months, not years." The news hit James like a physical blow. To find Martha only to lose her again seemed too cruel. When he was allowed to see her, he fought to keep his expression neutral. Martha wasn't fooled. "They told you, didn't they?" James nodded, taking her frail hand in his. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because I didn't want our reunion to be about my dying," she said simply. "I wanted it to be about your living." James stayed by her bedside as they ran more tests. When she slept, he worked remotely, answering emails and reviewing code on his laptop. May called with questions about the upcoming product launch. "I need more time," James told her. "Martha is sick, heart failure." May's voice softened. "I'm so sorry, James. Is there anything I can do?" "Actually, yes. Can you send the prototype of the health monitoring system? The one we're developing for senior care?" The next day, a package arrived containing a sleek watch and a small hub device. James set up the system in Martha's hospital room, explaining how it would monitor her heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels continuously. "It's still in development," he told her. but it's the best care technology available. Martha examined the watch with interest. Your invention? James nodded. Part of NeoGuard's health division. We're expanding beyond security systems. Martha's expression changed subtly. What kind of security systems? Surveillance mostly, facial recognition, behavioral analysis. Our newest system can predict potential security threats based on movement patterns. Martha was quiet for a long moment. And who uses this technology? Everyone from private homeowners to major corporations, some government agencies too. Something like disappointment flickered in Martha's eyes. I see. Before James could ask what was wrong, the doctor returned with release papers and strict instructions for home care. Martha could leave the hospital, but would need regular nurse visits and constant monitoring. James spent the next 2 days transforming Martha's home. He hired contractors to fix the roof and install a new heating system. He purchased a comfortable hospital bed for the living room, so Martha wouldn't have to navigate the stairs. He interviewed and hired a full-time nurse with experience in cardiac care. Through it all, Martha watched with a mixture of gratitude and something else, a sadness James couldn't quite understand. On her first night home from the hospital, after the nurse had retired to the spare bedroom, Martha asked James to sit with her. There's something I need to tell you, she said. Something I should have told you long ago. James pulled his chair closer to her bed. You can tell me anything. Martha took a shaky breath. When I found you that night, in the snow, it wasn't the first time I'd held a newborn baby. You had a child of your own, James said gently. I assumed as much. Martha shook her head, tears filling her eyes. I had a daughter, Sarah, but when she was just 6 months old, I left her. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. What do you mean, left her? I abandoned her, Martha whispered, the words cutting like glass. Her father was a violent man. He hurt me regularly, and I feared for Sarah's safety, but I had no money, no family to help. So I left her on the steps of a church and ran. I was barely 20 years old and terrified. Tears tracked down her weathered cheeks. When I found you that night, I thought, maybe it was a chance to make things right, to save another child the way I couldn't save my Sarah. James sat in stunned silence. This woman, who had risked everything to keep him, who had loved him so fiercely, had once abandoned her own child. Did you ever try to find her? He asked finally. Martha nodded. Years later, when I was in a better situation, but the records were sealed, the church had no information. It was as if she had vanished. That's why you kept me, James said softly, even knowing you might not be able to provide everything I needed. Yes, Martha admitted, selfish perhaps, but I loved you from the moment I found you, and I've carried the guilt about Sarah every day of my life. James leaned forward, taking Martha's hands in his. Finding your daughter, would that give you peace? Martha's eyes widened. After all this time? She'd be in her 70s now. She probably wouldn't want to see me anyway. Let me try, James said. Please, you gave me a second chance at life. Let me help you find Sarah. Finding Sarah Wilson proved more difficult than James anticipated. With Martha's permission, he hired a specialized genetic genealogy firm, providing them with Martha's DNA sample and all the information she could remember about the church where she had left her baby daughter over 70 years ago. While the search proceeded, James split his time between Millfield and his office in the city. He purchased the house next door to Martha's and had it renovated into a comfortable home office. 3 days a week, he worked remotely from Millfield, spending evenings with Martha. They developed a routine. Martha would share stories from her life while James listened, filling in the missing decades between them. Sometimes they simply sat together, watching old movies, Martha's health monitor, quietly tracking her vital signs. Tell me about your parents, Martha asked one evening. The ones who adopted you. James smiled. The Chens. They're wonderful people. They'll be visiting next month. They're excited to meet you. And they never minded that you kept searching for me? They encouraged it, James said. They always told me that love multiplies, it doesn't divide. There was room in my heart for all of you. Martha nodded thoughtfully. Wise people. As autumn turned the leaves to gold, Martha's condition stabilized. The new medications and constant monitoring helped, though the underlying heart failure couldn't be reversed. James noticed she tired more easily, napped more frequently. At the office, tensions were growing over NeoGuard's latest government contract. The surveillance system James had designed was being considered for border security implementation. You need to address the ethical concerns, May told him during a video call. The privacy advocates are gaining traction. They're saying our technology could be used to target vulnerable communities. James rubbed his temples. Schedule a meeting with the development team. We need to build in more safeguards. That evening, he shared his concerns with Martha as she sat in her favorite chair, a quilt across her lap, despite the warmth of the improved heating system. I created NeoGuard to protect people, he explained, but now I worry it could be used to control them instead. Martha considered his words. Power is neutral, James. It's how people use it that matters. You built this technology. You have a responsibility to ensure it's used ethically. What would you do? He asked. Martha smiled. At my age, you stop fearing consequences. I do what's right, whatever the cost. The next day, James made two significant decisions. First, he announced that Chen Technologies would add an ethics board with veto power over all contracts. Second, he implemented a kill switch in the NeoGuard system that would disable surveillance features if they were used outside agreed parameters. This might cost us the government contract, May warned. Then we'll find other clients, James replied, ones who share our values. 3 months after beginning the search for Sarah Wilson, James received a call from the genealogy firm. We found a potential match, the investigator told him. A 73-year-old woman named Sarah Geller, living in a retirement community about 50 miles from Millfield. DNA comparison suggests she's almost certainly Martha's daughter. James thanked them and sat for a long time in his office, considering how to proceed. Finally, he drove to Martha's house. He found her napping in her chair, looking more frail than ever. He waited until she woke naturally, her eyes brightening when she saw him. You're here early today, she said. James knelt beside her chair. They found Sarah. Martha's hand flew to her heart. Are you certain? The DNA match is conclusive. She's living not far from here. Tears filled Martha's eyes. Does she know about me? Not yet. I wanted to ask you first. Do you want me to contact her, or would you prefer to write her a letter? Martha took a shaky breath. After all this time, I don't know if I have the right. The same could be said about me finding you, James reminded her gently. Sometimes second chances come when we least expect them. 2 days later, James sat in the lobby of Peaceful Pines Retirement Village, waiting for Sarah Geller. He had called ahead, explaining only that he had information about her biological mother and would like to meet. A tall woman with silver hair and a straight-backed posture approached him. Her eyes, the same shape as Martha's, studied him curiously. Mr. Chen? Her voice was lower than Martha's but carried the same clear tone. Mrs. Geller, thank you for meeting me. James gestured to the chairs nearby. This is a delicate conversation. He explained how he had come to know Martha, carefully sharing the story of his own abandonment and rescue, Martha's care, and their recent reunion. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression giving away nothing. She abandoned me, Sarah said finally. Left me on church steps in winter. Yes, James acknowledged, an act of desperation by a very young woman in an abusive relationship. an act she has regretted every day of her life since. And now she wants to meet me, after 73 years? She doesn't expect anything, James said. But she would like your forgiveness, if you can find it in your heart. She's dying, Mrs. Geller. Heart failure. The doctors say she has perhaps 3 months. Sarah looked away, blinking rapidly. I had wonderful adoptive parents, a good life. I never felt the absence of my biological mother. Then you were fortunate, James said. As was I, but Martha has carried this wound for decades. Sarah studied him. You care for her very much. She saved my life, in more ways than one. Sarah nodded slowly. I'll need time to think about this. James left his card with her and returned to Martha, who was waiting anxiously. He told her the truth, that Sarah had listened, that she needed time, that nothing was certain. 3 weeks passed with no word from Sarah. Martha declined further, spending more time in bed than out of it. The nurse called James one night with concerns about Martha's oxygen levels. He drove to Millfield immediately, arriving just after midnight. Martha was awake, her breathing labored despite the oxygen. She smiled when James entered. No rushing to my bedside in the middle of the night, she scolded weakly. I'm not going anywhere just yet. James pulled a chair close. I'm exactly where I need to be. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the medical equipment humming softly in the background. I was thinking about the night I found you, Martha said suddenly. How the wind howled, how tiny you were. Your eyes, so serious even then. James took her hand. You've told me the story many times. But did I ever tell you that when I held you that first night, I felt my heart heal? Just a little, for the first time since leaving Sarah. Before James could respond, the doorbell rang, a startling sound in the pre-dawn quiet. The nurse went to answer it. Moments later, Sarah Geller stood in the doorway of Martha's room. You came, Martha whispered, tears filling her eyes. Sarah approached cautiously. I needed to see for myself. The resemblance between them was subtle but unmistakable. Something in the set of their mouths, the arch of their eyebrows. 2 women separated by time and circumstance, yet undeniably connected. I'm so sorry, Martha said, her voice breaking, for leaving you, for not being braver. Sarah sat carefully on the edge of the bed. The church gave my parents a note that was pinned to my blanket. It said, Please love her, I can't keep her safe. I've kept it all these years. Martha closed her eyes, tears tracking down her cheeks. I never knew if they found you, if you were loved. I was, Sarah assured her. Very much so. Martha reached out a trembling hand. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah took it. James slipped quietly from the room, giving them privacy for a reunion 73 years in the making. In the days that followed, Sarah visited regularly. She brought photo albums showing her childhood, her wedding, her 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. Martha drank in these images of the family she never knew, experiencing a bittersweet joy in the discovery of her descendants. Martha rallied temporarily, her spirit lifted by Sarah's forgiveness, but her body continued its inevitable decline. By spring, she was bedridden most days, though her mind remained sharp. On a warm May morning, Martha asked to sit on the porch swing that James had installed. Sarah and James helped her outside, wrapping her in blankets despite the mild weather. My 2 children, Martha said, looking from one to the other, found against all odds. James knelt beside her. You saved us both, Martha, me from the cold, Sarah from a dangerous situation. Martha shook her head. Number you saved me. From loneliness, from guilt, from dying without making peace. They stayed on the porch until sunset, talking quietly as golden light filtered through the leaves. When darkness fell, Martha asked James to bring her the small wooden box from her bedside table. Inside was a handwritten letter and a black and white photograph of a young woman holding an infant. "This is Sarah and me," Martha explained. "The only picture I kept when I ran. And the letter, it's for both of you. For after." A week later, Martha Wilson passed peacefully in her sleep, with James holding one hand and Sarah the other. At the funeral, dozens of community members came to pay respects. Mrs. Patel from the corner store brought flowers. Martha's bingo friends shared stories of her kindness. Children from the neighborhood placed drawings on her casket. Together, James and Sarah read the letter Martha had left them. "My dearest children, life rarely gives us the chances we truly deserve. I was given 2 remarkable second chances, finding James and being found by him, which led me back to Sarah. Whatever mistakes I made, whatever pain I caused, I hope you can remember that love was at the heart of every choice. James, use your brilliant mind and your resources to help others find their second chances. Sarah, know that not a day passed when I didn't think of you and hope you were safe and loved. In the end, we are all just people trying to make our way through darkness, occasionally blessed by unexpected light. Be that light for others whenever you can. With eternal love, Martha." 6 months later, Chen Technologies launched a new division, Second Chance Initiative. Using the same advanced technology that had powered NeoGuard, the program helped families separated by war, natural disasters, and other circumstances reconnect with lost loved ones. James remained in Millfield half the week, working from the house next to Martha's, which he kept exactly as she had left it. Sarah visited often, bringing her grandchildren who played in the yard where James had installed a swing set. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, James would sit on the porch swing and remember the night a blizzard had brought him to Martha's door, a night when 2 lost souls found each other and began a journey that would eventually heal 3 generations of wounds. In Martha's garden, planted with seeds she had saved, flowers bloomed each spring, a reminder that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to beautiful outcomes, and that it's never too late for love to find its way home. For now, that was enough. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.